投資しなさいよ。この子ったらここがどこだか分かってきたのかしら。まさか博物館だと思ってお勉強に来たんじゃないでしょうね。ここが全て世間様とあべこべで、人が出口に使うところを入り口に使うところだと知ったら目を向くでしょうね。かわいそうに。おミュージックがないわよ、おミュージックが。
またモーツァルト。
いいえ、これ。
Folks, this is Mittacast here, and this is another entry into the Mittacast. Today, I am doing another single podcast, and I'm going to be talking about the philosophy of Alexandre Kojève, particularly his theories on ontology as it relates to time, eternity, and the concept. So, I've talked about Kojève before in this channel several times. I think the first time I talked about Kojève was, I think it was a couple of years ago. I was doing a channel update video, and I was basically just elaborating on what I was going to work on for the course of the channel. And also, I did talk about him again in another channel update video, which was just an update of the video I was going to work on, and it was I think it was the Kojève. Was it Kojève 2 or Identity and Difference to Kojève Anime Animalism, I think it was called. But in that video, I was talking about Kojève's concept of Japanese snobbery as it related to post-war Japanese culture and anime. And that video itself, or that aspect of Kojève that I discussed in that video, was more focused on, like, material history, cultural analysis, not too much on ontology, and I guess you could say ontology a little bit, because the concept of Japanese snobbery is fundamentally an ontological concept, because it deals with, like, what is the nature of being in this particular epoch, so on and so forth. But in relation to that video, I think it was really more about, like, Japanese cultural history, anime, and how that, was a byproduct of that particular historical cultural moment. So, with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about Kojève as a philosopher. So, Alexandre Kojève was a very influential French philosopher in the 20th century. He is one of the most foremost important Hegel scholars in the French Continental tradition in the 20th century. He was one of the early French thinkers to bring Hegel to mainstream French academic culture. There was a guy before him, I believe his name was Jean Wall, and he was more of a Kantian philosopher. That's important because his encounter with Hegel was more so through the perspective of Hegel as a rationalist philosopher, or a philosopher that's really concerned with abstract systems. What Kojève does that's very fundamentally, or it's very fundamental to the trajectory of post-war French thought, is he grounds Hegel in history in a weird way. He brings Marx, or he turns Hegel into Marx. And I say that's weird because Hegel's not really, well, Hegel came before Marx, Hegel wrote the Phenomenology, funny enough, on my birthday, October 14th, 1807, just when the first Napoleon, the pulling of the French Republic, the First French Republic, enters Germany. At the time, it was called the Holy Roman Empire. And he's, the famous line, "I've seen the world spirit, history's over, yada yada yada." I'm paraphrasing here. This is not exactly what he said, but it's a general paraphrasing. But yeah, so that book, Phenomenology of Spirit, was it predates Marx, and essentially Phenomenology of Spirit creates the foundation for the conversations that would be discussed in the 19th century and German philosophy and a broader continental philosophy. And when Marx encounters Hegel, he is coming from a completely different angle. He is more of a materialist. He's a social theorist, economic theorist. He's not necessarily a philosopher in the strict sense as Hegel was. So when he comes to Hegel, he wants to solve a question, or he wants to solve the problem of pragmatism. Like, how can we change society now? How can we change the state, and what is the process that um brought us to the current social economic world that we live in now. So with that, he brings in dialectical materialism, which is an inversion of the original Hegelian dialectic. So going back to Kojève, he takes that, as well as taking Heidegger's fixation on ontology and the history of Western ontology, going back to the Greeks and the pre-Socratics, and he essentially throws them into a blender with Hegel and creates this new philosophy, or this new I say it's a new philosophy because it is essentially like his own philosophy, but it's also a very idiosyncratic interpretation of Hegel, because ultimately, with this philosophy that Kojève creates, he's using the language and tools of Hegelian, you know, uh, philosophy. So, yeah, is that period in time, like I said, is very influential, because the people who were going to the lectures at this time, and just to name a few, Jacques Lacan, as you know, Lacanian psychoanalysis, Joseph Bataille, French surrealists, and also very influential in post-war French continental thought. Jean Sartre, one of the pillars of French existentialism and also phenomenology. And I'm trying to think of who else. That's just a few, just name off the top of my head. So, like I said, essentially these people will shape the intellectual cultural landscape from 1930 and forward. And also, like I mentioned previously in several videos, he's also famous for the end of history thesis. So you read the Phenomenology Spirit. There is a end of history in Hegel, but it's not necessarily the same end of history that Kojève pontificates through Hegel in his study of Hegel's phenomenology. The original end of history was essentially a more abstract, more spiritual notion of spirit, guys, making sense of itself through history, and taking these abstract concepts such as notions and grounding them into a material reality. Then there's like this internal process, but with Kojève, what he does with this, he grounds, once again, like I say, he grounds this history, and he brings it to the social slash economic political reality of 20th century Europe. And he says that the end of history is essentially the history of the state, being a permanent um, fixture for human relations, and in a way it recreates nature, because it provide. I mean, it's basically the communist end of history, dialectical materialism. Marx says at I believe it was I think he says this in what was it, the Communist Manifesto. He says, like, the end of history is a class of society. essentially is that, but he updates it a little bit with the concepts of animal barbarism and Japanese snobbery, and these are the two type of ontological modes as well as societies that make up the end of history. So for Kojève, the end of history, or these societies are essentially the same play on a core fundamental post-historical ontological state of being where the state is a replacement of nature and there's no negation through work and labor and struggle. So, you know, with that being said, I want to get into the chapter in question, chapter 5. So, right quick, the introduction of Hegel is the main work I'm pulling from when I discuss the concepts of, or Kojève's interpretation of the ontological concepts of time, eternity, and the concept itself. And the introduction of Hegel was a work not published by Kojève himself, but it was written by a stenographer who would attend the lectures and listen on to what Kojève was speaking about in relation to Hegel. So chapter 5 is a lecture series he did. I can't remember exactly the precise dates, but I know it was the mid-30s. So in this lecture series, chapter 5, he discusses a problem of Western ontology, which is a problem between the relationship of time and internal. So what does he mean by that? So, you know, contemporary society, we take for granted these notions of time, or time being sequential, causal. Something happens, and consequently, something has to, or you do something, you make an action, and consequently, something proceed or follows that action. Well, COVID is flipping that notion of time on its head and exposing it as a process, just like everything in Hegelian dialectical philosophy. Everything's a process. So he shows the process of how we get to time as a sequence of events versus time as a internal or a separation of a reality that changes versus a reality that's always the same. So he goes back to the ancient Greeks. So he's really going to, well, he goes first to Plato. So he goes first to Plato and Aristotle. He does talk about the pre-Socratics, and I will come back to the pre-Socratics in a moment. But for right now, I want to talk about the Academy in the fourth century classical philosophical tradition of Plato and Aristotle. So he goes to Plato and Aristotle first, and he talks about, how the way they dealt with these issues of time and eternal. And keep in mind, I want to reinstate this. During this whole lecture series, he's grounding this discussion in ontology. So from this perspective, he's using a combination of, once again, not Hegel, I'm sorry, Heidegger and Marx to make this ontological argument. So Heidegger comes in this moment because he's using Heidegger's critique of Western ontology as a means to critique this fundamental problem in Western ontology of time and eternal. So, like I said, going back to Plato, so Plato he's not the first philosopher in the Western tradition. Really, philosophy goes all the way back to, I think it was the 6th century BC, with the dude, what is it? I want to say it's the Ionian school because Thales is the first philosopher in the Western tradition, if I remember correctly. But so these guys are truly the beginning. In Ionian, Milesian school, this is in Asia Minor. That's important because the culture of Asia Minor is very or Asia Minor at the time is very logocentric in the sense that they're starting to discuss these ideals of monotheism, or logos to monotheism. You think of the religion of Zarathustra. It comes from this region in on the globe. So yes, the first philosophers pre-Socratic, and these are the first thinkers in the Western tradition that deal with the concepts of time and eternity. But like I said, I'm kind of talking ahead of myself here. Um, yeah, so Plato is typically considered the first, Greek philosopher because he's really the first philosopher to write down the whole corpus and to teach these concepts on a mass scale. The previous pre-Socratic philosophers, they had followers and whatnot, but it was never on the scale that, like, there wasn't an academy, like Plato. So Plato teaches these concepts, and he talks a lot about the world of forms and the world of appearance. And the world of forms are this eternal system in where things are concepts come from. They're never changing. They're perfect in themselves and form the reality that we live in. So, like the concept, for example, or a concept of the chair in Platonic idealism, a chair, there's a perfect chair that is nested in the world of the forms. Then there's a chair that we experience and interact with in the world of appearance. So this chair that we interact with is not perfect; it's imperfect because in its sense, or in the sense that it's always going to be there's always going to be another chair. That chair can deteriorate, break down, so on and so forth. But this chair that created essentially the blueprint for the chair that we experience is never going to change. It's never going to deteriorate. It just exists in this, pure objective reality that is outside of the reality experience. And Kojève says this is a problem because, you know, if you have a world that is internal that we can't interact with directly, how do we make sense of, core fundamental human, you know, I won't say beliefs, but human inclinations like freedom, action, using freedom and action to change the world and turn it more into one more preferable for us to live in, also to conform to what we um, perceive as, the ideal. So, you know, that is the first critique, right? Well, he does say that Plato is very, I mean, even though he critiques Plato, he does say Plato is very important because Plato, outside of creating, the dialectic of eternity in time through the forms and appearance, he also introduces the importance of language through the concept of theos, which is ancient Greek for essentially God, So theos is the connection between the appearance and, the forms. And when we speak, language itself is a manifestation of theos. We are essentially enacting the forms into reality. So we are beginning to slowly work our way to what will later be Hegelian, attorney or Hegelian dialectics. But like I said, I'm speaking ahead of myself. So next we have Aristotle. So Aristotle is the next step, and step back a little bit more. Once again, if you pay attention to the logic of the argument, we are watching in real time the dialectical process working through the history of Western ontology as Kojève speaks it or he critiques it. So from this, we have the appearance from Plato or eternity in time through the forms and appearance as spoken through Theos from Plato. Then from Aristotle, we take that influence and we have eternity in time, which is the forms are just natural biological phenomenon that repeats itself in time, which, in itself, it sounds like it is a major upgrade. We have solved the problem of, the concept eternity and time. but there's still the fundamental lack of human agency. And this is what Kojève speaks on, is essentially if we are, if concepts exist in time eternally, and they are always going to be there without our interaction with them, how do we change these concepts? How do we create, concepts that are conducive to, like I said before, our perception of reality, and also more preferable for us to interact with reality. So, we have evolution, once again, a dialectic from Plato to Aristotle, Aristotle being a negation. Then from this, we have the creation of mysticism and transcendence. So, mysticism in the Kojève interpretation of history of Western ontology is kind of like a middle or intermediate stage where, with mysticism, there's really no theos. There is a silence of language where, you know, the world outside of the appearance is a complete unknown. You don't necessarily know if the world that we experience is informed by a world of forms or it's complete nihilism. And you know, uh, Kojève has a problem with this because if man is reduced to silence, how can we change society or change the world that's more preferable to us? And also, how can we enact ideals if we don't even know these ideals exist? But, you know, like I said, this is a intermediate phase within this ontological critique that leads us into the modern period or the early modern period with Spinoza and his concept of the circle being or eternity being the circle and immediate reality. So, you know, going back to the pre-Socratics and Parmenides being one of the pre-Socratics, he's one of the first philosophers in the Western tradition. I want to say he was the first, if I remember correctly. He was the first philosopher in the Western philosophical tradition to deal with the concept of eternity and dualism and contradiction. And he said in his philosophy, keep in mind, that's another thing that makes the pre-Socratics different from Plato. The pre-Socratics, their writing is very poetic. It's very short, poetic. It's not systematic like Plato's and Aristotle is. And what Parmenides left down on his philosophy, which is not a lot, is a couple of fragments of prose poems dealing with the nature of contradictions and truth, aletheia. And within this dialogue, he talks about, or within this poem, he talks about, eternity being a circle or being the whole scope of reality, while also accounting for the non aspect or the non aspects of reality. So this is a contradiction in itself, and it also doesn't solve the problem of human will in changing reality once again to be preferred to us, and also bringing ideals into reality. This is the same problem with Spinoza that Kojève brings up, and he conflates Spinoza's system, or he draws a lot of similarities with Spinoza's system with the pre-Socratics, particularly Parmenides' system, like I discussed before. And he says that, Spinoza basically writes from the perspective of God, meaning which that if eternity is a closed circle in reality and appearance and is completed, how can you possibly know that unless you are God Himself speaking reality into existence? Another contradiction, But with this, we do have another evolution in the dialectic where now real or eternity is a reflection on the self. The classic Hegelian syllogism, and syllogism is basically just like a logical argument. Classic Hegelian syllogism is I equals I, meaning which the self is essentially a reflection of the self, and he says this in the phenomenology of spirit. And from there, Kojève introduces, truly in this sense, the beginning of the Hegelian dialectic, and essentially man's journey from, complete alienation from himself to full understanding of himself through the negation of history. So now from this point, he's taking the notion of, or literally the Hegelian notion of, the self realizing itself through action, and he's applying it to history. And from here on out, he's building up to the end of history, and you have, literally the end of history with the the final historical state, and the two versions of, what the final historical state looks like. And like I said before, at this point, you know, history is completed, and history is total, and there's no negation to be solved. There's no negation to enact. And with this, you have the problem of, freedom. We're introducing the problem of freedom in the beginning. If history is already solved, and we live through all the historical processes through negation, how do humans live? How do humans, enact freedom? Um, and like I said, Kojève talks about this society through, Japanese snobbery and barbarism, and for him, that's it. Communism, and at the time that he was living when he wrote this, American post-war liberalism is just the perfected state. It's two sides of the perfected state. There's really not much else you can do about it. He even jokes about it in the introduction. And when I reference the introduction here, it's more of a footnote. It's not literally like, part of the lecture series. It's a footnote after um, a later revision of the introduction. And he says that the Soviet Union, at the time the Soviet Union still existed, Soviet Union and China are just basically America, just a slow version of what America is now, or at the time. But yeah, like this this society is the final, or these societies are the final societies, and because of this, we have the problem, like I said, of free will, and this is a true I want to say, well, fundamental, but also that's something where I want to say it's a true existential problem, because this is what was going on in the '60s with the student protests, what was going on in Japan at the time, with America occupying a Japanese country, and a government, and saw military bases, and creating the post-war consumer society. These young people did not feel like they had agency anymore. Everything that they were told about their society was completely destroyed, and the society that they were allowed to participate in was not a society that was governed by uh, their ancestors and the people who constructed the world effort. I mean, on surface it was, but practically it wasn't. I mean, for one, they didn't have a military in their constitution, Article 9. This is still a problem going on with their government today. They can't have a full scale military. So, if you can't defend yourself as a nation, you necessarily, by definition, you have no agency. So, yeah, this is just one case study, but all the societies post-war were wrestling with this issue. French society during the I believe it was the Fourth and Fifth Republic after the war, or the Fifth Republic. I think it was the Fifth Republic with Charles de Gaulle in the '60s. After the war, they were dealing with the same issues of freedom. How do we live after the tragedy of World War II? And also in America with the Civil Rights Movement, and the freedom rides in the South and the Vietnam War, they were all trying to figure out how do we live in what is functionally a post-historical society. And that's where you get the introduction of post-structuralism, critical theory, and all this stuff, trying to deconstruct this post-war society to possibly create a new or a space for freedom to exist. So I think from here, I would say that some of this critical theory, post-structuralism, was helpful because it did show that society at this time was a totalized society that did not grant freedom to the citizens in the true sense, true ethnological sense. But it also hollowed out the society and created a Ouroboros effects that, in a weird roundabout way, it recapitulated the total system that was created with the post-war, post-historical state, which enters into the 90s, late 20th century, in the 21st century with digital technology, social media, the internet, and how society is today, where everything is you know basically digital and from here virtual. What we understand as time in the Kojève sense, where we negate things to action in a historical world that's defined by space and time, that no longer exists. Everything is now interacted with digitally, and what we understand as time, and like I said, the Kojève sense is now flattened and spatialized. So what we have now is essentially the end of the historical, the end of the post-historical state being the World Wide Web, and how we interact with that post-historical state is fundamentally different. So the critical theory tradition, ranging from the late 60s to, I would say, the end of the 20th century, would say that you interact with the post-war state, or you search for freedom within the post-war state by negating this fundamental contradictions, right? How can you enable freedom, or how can you promote freedom if there is black people in the South who do not have any rights, or there's gay people in the North who are being policed for their sexual identity, so on, or women, do not have, reproductive rights, or they're not protected equally under the law at the workplace. So that's how the critical theories and post-structuralists saw the way to negate this post-historical society to enable freedom again. Well, like I said, that did not necessarily work in the way that they envisioned, because what happens is the state, after the historical reality of the state from the 60s onward, just assimilates all these critiques within the system, and creates room to essentially accommodate these critiques and handle these critiques from their perspective. So, with that, I go back to history, ironically enough, and I bring into the concept of Midare, which is Japanese for entanglement. And I make the argument that entanglement in this post-historical digital virtual state is fundamentally the ontological position that we find ourselves in, the digital 21st century. And this Midare is essentially the nature of the state itself, and I think I said before in my previous video on Derrida, it is the nature of the algorithm in relation to social media, But it's also the nature of the post-historical state in the 21st century. And from this, what we understand is that Midare, because the state is always trying to accommodate, these disparate elements, is always, at breaking at the cracks. It's always at the seams of, or is always at the cups of breaking down as it seems. But like I said, the state accommodates this stuff and it recapitulates itself based on, the imminent critiques or imminent, fractures within it. So for the state accommodating this, the solution, or I think the problem of I said it right. The solution to agency in this epoch is to lean into Mindare, lean into the entanglement, and allow ourselves to live within the friction of the post-historical state and the digital reality of the post-historical state. And, with this, I don't believe that history is now returning in the Covian sense where we are back into a world where we have to create it in a way that is preferable for us in order to survive. But we are now curators of a virtual world where we use the signifiers created by the post-historical state and the, digital algorithmic society or culture society to essentially recontextualize these delocated signifiers from history within a present, um, immediate, and singular uh, perspective within this post-historical society and culture. So, um, with that, the concept going all the way back to the beginning of Western ontology with, you know, Plato and Aristotle, the concept is now the trace itself. And the trace going back to Derrida, and he talks about in his philosophy, um, the trace is now, like I said, the trace is now the concept where what we understand as history, as immanence, as freedom is our relationship with the concept and how we perceive the concept in our given subjective states as it is mediated through the post-historical state in digital technology. So that is it for this introduction, or sorry, not introduction, my bad. This this incarnation. I don't know why I had a blank thought right there. This incarnation of the Mittacast, and as always, oh yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I guess I'll do a few housekeeping things. So I have a Substack, and I talked about my Substack before in a previous video. I think it was a channel update video. It was a spring channel update video. I don't talk about it much, but I'm gonna bring it up more because my Substack is essentially in concert with my YouTube channel and the videos and the topics I discuss in my YouTube videos. So this podcast that I did, the framework for the podcast was built upon several articles that are now published on my Substack as I speak about it right now. And these articles is the philology of Midare. This is where I elaborate on the concept of Midare as it relates to Japanese literary ontology, going back to their first major work, or one of the first major works in Japanese history, which is Lady Murasake's Genji Monogatari, which in translation is The Tale of Genji. I go over that. I go over the philology of it. I'm sorry, the philology of it, meaning which the history of the word and its relationship to material history, society of the times, and this is Heian Jedi, Heian era court society, and this is a society where Genji Monogatari was published, and how that shaped the language, also the concept in Genji Monogatari. So yeah, that's one. Another one I used for this was the three modernities. So basically, the loose architecture of this podcast is the three modernities. I go into depth the history of modern ontology going back to the 19th century with the introduction of modernity as a concept, as coined by the French poet and decadent I was gonna say philosopher. He's really a poet and art critic. Charles Baudelaire in Flowers du Mal, which is the flowers of evil in English. And yeah, so yeah, from 19th century Charles Baudelaire to post modernism with William Burroughs to I think to the digital age with digital social media and all that stuff. So yeah, check that out. Check out my Substack, and I will connect a link to this podcast to my Substack. And what else? That's everything, guys. So like I said, if you enjoy this content, if you enjoy this podcast, this conversation, please like and subscribe, share, and if you have I was gonna say, if you have like any ideals for other topics that you want me to discuss on the channel, let me know. I'll be very glad to look and you know bring forth the ideals. So yeah, thank you very much, and like always, have a great day.